Hey, welcome to Q&A, where you ask your questions on faith and life, and I do my best to give a biblical perspective. Well, let's jump into today's question. Let me bring it up. Are any of the deuterocanonical texts from the Catholic Bible worthwhile to read? So it's a fair question. If you're not familiar with this term deuterocanonical text, what it's really referring to is what we would call, and you perhaps may have heard of, the Apocrypha. The Roman Catholics, the Eastern Orthodox, call it deuterocanonical, meaning second canon. So it's a canon that sits alongside of the major canon, whereas we would call them Apocrypha, which means hidden or secret. And perhaps there's a reason for that. What we're referring to in terms of those books, the Apocrypha, the deuterocanonical books, there's 7 extra books plus some changes or additions to Esther, Daniel, and a whole psalm. They've included Psalm 151. And on top of that, the Eastern Orthodox add an additional 3 books that the Roman Catholic Church initially had but dropped. Begs the question, if you're not familiar with this idea, where did they come from? And quite simply, it's because originally there was 39 books in the Old Testament, as we know it, what they call a Hebrew Bible. But when it was translated into Greek, it's what we know as the Septuagint. At some point, there were these extra books that were added. And when the Bible came to be translated from Greek into Latin, because that was the language of the West in the 4th century, Roman Catholicism, all those sorts of things. The person who translated it, a guy called Jerome, he noted that there were more books in the Septuagint than there were in the Hebrew Bible, but translated them anyhow, and that's how they became included. The reason that the Protestants don't include them is that we don't recognize them as scripture in the same way as the Catholics would. We don't recognize them as scripture because we appeal to the older canon of the Hebrew Bible, which that these extra books are quite a later addition to what was already there and accepted as Hebrew scripture. The Roman Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox, for example, would consider them inspired in some way, whereas Protestants don't, because, as I say, they sit outside the canon. They sit outside what the Hebrew Bible was and how it had been received and understood. So that's why we don't include them. That's why we don't recognize them as authoritative in the way that, for example, the Roman Catholic Church does. So that's what we're referring to. The question is, are they worth reading? This may surprise you. I think they are, because they give us some insights into those times that we might not otherwise get. I always find it fascinating that the guy who translated the Septuagint, the guy Jerome, even he noted that the church reads them not because they're scripture. Think, as I say, 2 Timothy 3, 16, 17, inspired, etc. But he says we read them because they give us context about the Jewish worldview. And I think that's important because, you need to remember that heaven was silent for 400 years from the time God last spoke in the book of Daniel, for example, and the time we hear a voice in the wilderness crying, "Prepare the way of the Lord," in the beginning of what we call the New Testament. And so this helps us understand that time. It helps us understand how Israel saw itself in the economy of God as it sought to hold on to its identity as the people of God in a world that was changing, a world that was hostile towards them, a world which required them to fit in some way, a world that was overpowering their commitment to their faith. So it gives us some insights into that. I think particularly of 1st and 2nd Maccabees. It gives us some historical understanding of what was happening around in the nations at that time that help us understand something of the timing of the incarnation of God becoming man, and the timing of that first Christmas. It helps us understand the nature and the significance of the ministry of John the Baptist and why he was described the way that he was. It helps us understand so much that we would otherwise miss, and so I think we should read it for that reason. Having said that, we should never read it as scripture because it sits outside of It sits alongside of, but it's outside of Scripture, the canon. Part of the reason the Reformers rejected it, quite aside from the fact that it was written after the Hebrew Bible, was that at that point in time, the Roman Catholic Church had based some, shall we say, questionable doctrine on the Apocrypha. I think, for example, of the doctrine of purgatory, which they still hold today. But alongside of that, there were others, like for indulgences. And these all grew out of some of the books in the Apocrypha and the deuterocanonical books. And so that's one of the reasons why they were rejected. So you need to bear that in mind and just see them as useful windows to give some insight, but nothing more than that. So as a Protestant, that would be the view of the Reformers. Certainly it's my view as well. So I hope that answers your question. Hey, if you've got questions on faith and life, jump over to slido.com, use the hashtag askhamish. I'd love to hear from you. But that's it for now. Until next time, God bless.